just doing a little recap of the previous conversations. And thank you so much for sort of bringing us through different journeys, through your personal journey, exploring the archives here in Venice and in Liverpool and other places, but also the journey of those beads across time, across Europe, and how they made their way through Africa, and also how they continue to evolve through time in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. I think that I was equally fascinated by Yala's proposal of rest as resistance, and really the negation of movement and the possibilities that sort of lay therein, and the stories also that inspired this proposal. The stories that Vinicius shared with us also help us kind of consider these binaries that exist in a lot of our lives between nature and culture, men and women, between different spaces. And I want to kind of start this conversation by saying that one of the things that struck me with engaging with beads is that it seems like across time, whether it was the impirarese who would be collectively kind of coming together to work, they would kind of share stories. And when the beads were kind of disseminated around the world, they found communities who would work together with the beads and also share stories. And across time, what we've come to realize in working on this project with Kapwani is that we were bringing people together to share stories. And so I think my first question is about the power and potential of mythology and of storytelling in your research. And I don't know who wants to start with this question, but I thought it was a good place to start. Yep.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think part of what I wanted to say here was that sometimes we use this notion of myth or mythology as something that is opposite to truth. Like, oh, such and such is a myth, so that's not really true. It's just a myth. But I think that that's a very poor reading of the word, because mythology can sometimes, or has often, a power that is the power of truth, because its truth is something that is being made through it, right? Mythology changes and has this connection with the past, but it also has this potency to bring new elements and adapt, because it is part of the oral tradition. It has this extreme malleability to bring in new elements. So something like seed beads that were, not common, that came with first colonial contact in Amazonia, they were incorporated into mythology. People found a place for them to be incorporated into it and to make sense and to help people understand their daily lives and where they live and what they were doing and their activities. I wanted to underline this idea of mythology as this powerful force that creates meaning.
Yes, and please tell us.
I guess, Colette? I think you could think of it as sort of the story societies tell themselves, right? When I look at my research, when you think about the advertisements for Venetian beads, right? There's this mythology of, Venice is the sole producer of beads, and the historical record obviously is saying that's not true. But that's the way that Venice is telling the story of production to itself, and is interweaving beads with the mythical line of the city, the symbolic line of the city, and with these sort of themes of abundance. And then you can look at beads in the Yoruba context and the mythical origins of their creation, which is also deeply tied into the historical origins of the rise of sacred kingship in Yoruba. And so you can have, Olokun is the first kind of glassmaker in this place, and then that gets brought forward through political power, and you can have this sort of kind of timeless, the way that the Venetians tell the story of their beads, it's this sort of timeless production, right? And it really started in the 13th century. So I think we can think about myths as the way that societies tell stories about themselves to themselves.
Yeah, definitely. That's very interesting. What about you, Yala? How does it play into your own research?
Oh, it's playing because, as I said when I started, I work with the nationalist materials and nationalist languages or nationalist ideologies are rooted in mythology, and a kind of this is the what said Benedict Anderson in his famous book about la communauté. I have the title in French, Imaginary Communities. So this is the thesis. And for example, what was interesting in the I work on two traditions that are completely different. But what is interesting for me is to understand what it means to inhabit a land from a diasporic perspective. And the perspective of Garvey, which is rooted in a certain history of blackness, which is the one of the slave trade and the Middle Passage, is not linked to the other history of the independence I was telling about. But what is interesting is that, for example, in both those human trajectories, a way to find, how can I say, to give content to a political agency is built through a mythology. I mean, this text of Garvey for me is really important. I know that it can be really difficult for us to take the spectrum of Garvey because it's a very difficult author. It's some texts are awful, some texts are simple the negation of my own existence, but all the onirical images, of course, of the ship, of the returning, are rooted in a kind of a Black Christian, African Christian theology, which is also a big eschatology that gives a place for those humans who have been displaced, and that can say, you belong to a diaspora. It means you belong to a people. This is what it is about a diaspora. Diaspora has nothing to do, I think, with the creolization. Can I say something? Do I have 2 minutes? Okay. For example, when you read Glissant, I love Glissant, really. But I really don't think like Glissant because he starts with his masterpiece, The Caribbean Discourse, starts with the negation of Garvey, Césaire, Padmore, and Fanon, because they embody all those four Caribbean thinkers, embody a kind of myth, the myth of the returning back to Africa. And Glissant said, the problem with this myth is that it says that we all belong to a diaspora. But as a Caribbean person, I don't belong to diaspora. I was born from the abyss. So there is no continuity between the people of Africa and the people who we are as people who have been deported from Africa through the slave trade. It means that, for example, Garvey says completely the contrary to Glissant. He says, we are not creolized people living in this new land. We are black, not as the white have invented us. We are black because we are African. And blackness is the sign that tells that we are African. Race is linked to Africa. The concept of creolization was here to dismantle this relationship between blackness and Africa, and also to dismantle the idea of blackness, which is really interesting. And so here in the Garvey movement, you have this, what becomes a myth for the global blackness, which is the myth of the diaspora. We belong to one people, and this people is linked and finds its ontological substance in Africa. This is a big creation of a myth. And after, the thing is, what do we do with that? And how do we inhabit the world if we believe that we belong to a diaspora? It means that we are always strangers in strange lands. What do we do with that? So it's about mythology.
I think, do you want to add something? Yes, please.
Actually, it's a question to Yala, if that's okay.
Please.
As you were presenting, I was thinking a lot about, I think, a specific type of mythological thinking, which really interests me, which is Afrofuturism, right? Like the conceptions of not so much representations of the past movements, but of possible future movements. And I was thinking of examples within Afrofuturism in which the two types of movement that you talked about, forced or free, they kind of mingle together and are sometimes hard to analyze into either of them. So I was wondering if you could comment on Afrofuturism from your perspective.
I think it's really hard. It's a tough question, really, because there are a lot of imaginaries in Afrofuturism. And I think that if I had done the presentation, I'm sorry, because my English is very French, but if I had done the presentation in English, I think I would have been more sophisticated with the distinction between forced and free movements, because I think there is something to do that must be more precise. But if you allow me, and I will be very short, I would love to answer to your question, but not from the tradition of Afrofuturism, but from the situation where the word diaspora at the moment of my intellectual journey is a word that is completely melting. I don't know what is a diaspora. I don't know what is a black diaspora, and I don't know what is an African diaspora. And this journey, I had to live it through grief. When you lose people, you also lose many things, and you lose words. You lose libraries, and you lose representation of the word. And now I am at the moment where I don't know what is a diaspora. And if I have to think, and you were talking about stories, this it is a kind of a sublimation of a personal story, because the story of my family is a story of migration and of forced movements. And it's interesting to see what were they longing for when they were moving, and they were not moving to move. I mean, they were not moving all the time, and this is what sometimes I have headaches when I read some theorists of today, because they are just in the super utopia of movement. But all the people of my family wanted to have rest. My father flew from Congo during the dictatorship. He wanted to come back. He never came back. My mother, she's the daughter of Italian immigrants who flew from the fascist Mussolini regime and arrived in France, etc., to have rest, and they never moved again. And this is from this point of view that I think about movement, and then I read the history of independence, for example, in Congo, and you have a lot of tracts, manifestos, texts, biographies, memories that were written by the people who were leaders of independence, who had only one question: we don't want to move. Now we want to live in this country that is independent. But what kind of life do we want to have? Is it enough to be sovereign? Is it enough? Sovereignty is never enough, because the kind of life we want is about sustainability. And so this is from the situation that I think, and I proposed it. And it's true that you are completely right when you talk about Afrofuturism. And I still think about Sun Ra, which is, I don't know if we can call him, because, you know, the label of Afrofuturism has a specific history also. But it's true that at the end, we cannot inhabit the earth, but there is a place in the space. But we want to have a place in the world. This is exactly what said Marcus Garvey. But this place won't be in this world, but in the space, or I don't know, perhaps. So this is about the place. Yeah, thank you very much for it.
I think this idea of storytelling as a tool to belong in the world is extremely helpful, and certainly present in all of your research. We don't have too much time, so I'm just going to take an opportunity to ask one more question. Thinking about, storytelling, I want to move on to like this other gesture, which is to map making and cartography, and what is the importance of maps or of mapping in your research, and maybe also in the conversation that we're having as a tool potentially to belong or not. I don't know. I don't know who wants to start.
I can start. This isn't my research, but I just think it's interesting to note, because we are in Venice, that Venice was in the 16th century the center of map production of the New World, and so it was really interesting for me reading these late 18th century documents when I have this diplomat in Liverpool who's explaining how the slave trade works to the Venetian Senate, which is like the highest body, and he's sending back this map of Liverpool. Like, these guys might not know or might not understand how Atlantic world commerce works. Whereas in the 16th century, sort of the height of being an educated Venetian was to read these books about America and to look at these maps of the New World, because this was sort of the center of the cultural production. I can talk just very briefly when I think about maps of another project that I'm starting to work on, which is to look at the letters that the Royal African Company, which was a British African trade monopoly, sent between different locations on the African coast to their hub at Cape Coast Castle in modern-day Ghana in the late 17th century. And one of the things when I'm working with a cartographer, and we're trying to sort of map out various themes in the letters. And one of the things I'm really interested in is, where is their sphere of direct knowledge and where is their sphere of secondhand information? Like, what do they know directly and what do they sort of know through secondhand information, right? It's this kind of, to what extent are they embedded? And so that's a contemporary map that I'm trying to make actually, but it's a sort of a map of knowledge.
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting. Anyone else wants to attempt an answer?
I can, I think, say something in which I can describe a little bit of what some of my friends back in Amazonia are doing with map making nowadays, since it's been, as you were talking, so associated with colonialism, right? Map making as an instrument of power. And the part of Amazonia where I work was not mapped until the first scientific excursions in the end of the 19th, early 20th century. And now many of the people who work there are making their own kind of cartographies in which this sort of objectified view of distance is being substituted by how they think that the space should be represented in their own ways. And it's really great to see. I wish I had some of these maps to show, but they usually represent not just parts of the forest that are sacred or useful to them, but they also represent in map making social asymmetries, relationships between people, relationships between neighbors and neighboring villages, and that's also in the map, like friendly villages versus villages that you're not so friendly with are represented at different distances and in different sizes. So I think that cartography is not something that it's up for grabs, right? It's up to be transformed by some new approaches to it.
Yeah, really interesting, like this idea of an instrument of knowledge and the kinds of knowledge that might be important to map both of your work. Yala, does any of this kind of resonate with your research?
Yeah, and through also, I would say, I'm not sure, so I don't work on archives specifically. It is a really specific way of working. But when I work on documents, when I read, for example, what some leaders of independence, especially for this country, DRC, wrote, you can see that the idea of independence brings with itself a certain consciousness of the map. It is, that is to say, how did the African countries, how do they have been cartographed? You say that in English, cartographed or mapped? Okay. How were they mapped by the colonizers? And when we are independent, when we reclaim the independence, do we also have to dismantle the colonial cartographies? And this was a huge question because, as we all know, Africa was not empty. There were people before the colonizers, did their chaos, their cartographic chaos. And the question is, if we are independent, do we have to reclaim the type of countries we were, or do we have to be independent in the new maps that were proposed to us by the colonizers? The question of the frontiers was a really huge question, and this is interesting to see how the question of the cartography is also at the core of a question of emancipation or violence, but also a question of power. And you also have the idea that a map is, of course, a consciousness of the territory, but also a consciousness, of history. When you think about mapping, you also think about history and how the people were connected and how they were thinking the way they could live together. So these questions of mapping are also at the core of all the discourses about what is an independent country that you find in many manifestos, tracts, or ideologies of independence.
Absolutely, yeah. This also idea of relationship through maps and that being recorded there. I would like... Oh, sorry.
Can I just add a short
Absolutely.
So when there's just the limitations of maps by their physical side. So when I showed in my very last slide that map of European goods in the interior, that's a map that someone made, Mark Heller, made for my book. And I think the discussions last summer between me and him were here's 100 places I'd like to put on the map, and him, Annie, it's a 9x6 printed page. And so, I look at that map and all I see is, but there's 13 towns around Zurich that are making textiles for the slave trade. We can just put one. And so, what becomes abstracted and sort of representational, right? And then what is there?
Yeah, absolutely. The visualization is its own issue. I would like to offer the opportunity to the audience to participate and ask questions, or also share knowledge or a response if anyone is inclined.
Merci. La question est pour Yala. En fait, ma question serait de savoir, est-ce que tu penses pas que la mythologie, because we're talking about mythology, mais je veux prendre ça différemment, est-ce que la mythologie créée par le blackness, because everybody talking about blackness is in the morning, but I'm not feeling to be in that blackness. So now my question, I speak in English. So my question is, do you think that kind of blackness mythology, that it's coming to kill the whole story talking about everything's happening in Congo, in Senegal? Est-ce que tu penses que cette nouvelle façon de penser le blackness, ça ne vient pas tuer ça, au fait, cette singularité qu'il y a dans tous ces espaces qui existent?
No, but it's interesting. I will answer through a short story. Is that when I grew up as a young, committed person, I never, I always thought I was black. And I'm black, okay. It's not a thing, okay. But when I was reading, for example, the text coming from the US, I thought they were talking about me. And there was no difference between what I was. And when I arrived in the US for the first time for postdoctoral research, I had the opportunity to work with the Black theologian that I loved at the moment called James Cone. I don't know if you have heard about him. And he has written a lot of things about Black theology, of liberation. And I was really into these kind of things when I was younger. And I understood that what he was talking about when he was saying Black was a certain experience rooted in the history of the Middle Passage. And at the moment, I understood that Blackness was, at the first time, the experience of people that have faced the Middle Passage and that were living at that time in the US. And all the question of Black liberation theology, for example, was a way to face the super heavy racial terror that has shaped the north of America. And this was something because I remember I had a conversation about Africa with James Cone because I knew that he had traveled to Africa from great colloquium of Black liberation theology, African liberation theology. And I had the impression to read some, can I say that? No, I won't say that. But we were not talking about the same thing. And I don't know what he was talking about. It doesn't mean, I think that there is global experience of racism that we have to face through the questions that are really urgently underlined by Afro-pessimistic thinkers and things like that. But there is also a global conversation about the signifier Black, the signifier Africa, the signifiers memories that we can have. And of course, where we can see that the histories that shape us doesn't require sometimes the same words. And for that, I think I agree with you. We don't have to kill Blackness to say that, but I think that we have to reinvent languages because some stories have not been told and must be told, because if we don't know them, and especially in the part of this world we share, because I know we share a certain part of this world, the amount of violence is too heavy, and we need to work very seriously on some archives, and we have to focus. Yeah. So this is how I would answer. This is not an answer. I don't know. But thank you
It's a good answer, I think. Yeah, a very generous answer. Yeah,
didn't kill Blackness.
You did not kill Blackness. I think there's one more question we're going to have to wrap up after, but we would love to hear from you.
But I'm wondering about notions of indigeneity as it relates to notions of movement and trade routes, especially the idea of the other, which is my new word for the colonizer, the other's presence in the influence of trade and how trade routes are mapped. But then the reference for a professor from U of T around the Amazon, and then the references around that indigenous community, and for me, African indigenous communities, the break, and then kind of, as you were saying, around Blackness, how you're reformatting identity. So I'm wondering if there is commentary around that connection between indigenous identities and movements and routes.
Thanks for that question. It is a lot to tackle at once, because I think that indigeneity can get really complicated, and maybe similarly to Blackness, it makes more sense to think of local context, right? So I took the care to not say indigeneity or indigenous rather than Amazonians, because there's a particular history to Amazonia and colonial contact there that I wanted to highlight that also has to do with how people relate to their environment. So I'm an economic anthropologist, or that's what I thought I was, until I moved to Amazonia, and I realized that what the economy there is the environment. So that made me an environmental anthropologist, because to understand what it is to produce something in Amazonia means to understand people's relationship with the forest and the river and the spirits who control the forest and the river. So in that sense, I think that any kind of movement related to indigeneity in Amazonia is rooted in the forest, the river, the spirits who are there.
Thank you. What a wonderful way, I think, to kind of close this session. I want to thank you all three for your research and also for your generosity with all of us today in sharing, what you're working on. It's truly, truly special and appreciated. And I want to thank all of you for joining us today and for your interest. Thank you all.